9 most disgusting hygiene habits of medieval queens. The snow-white undergarments of the 16th century European elite were, in fact, bleached with fermented urine. Behind those magnificent portraits, there was no scent of roses. Beneath their beds lay chamber pots filled with days of accumulated waste. Upon their heads, elaborate wigs infused with animal fat served as breeding grounds for parasites. More terrifyingly, in many royal courts, they preferred to let layers of grime seal their pores for weeks, rather than touch hot water for cleansing. The following 9 facts about hygiene will expose a brutal historical paradox. In an era where nobility was measured by grotesque behaviors, the royals unwittingly imprisoned themselves in a toxic ecosystem, where their very status was the thing consuming them from within. On number 1, waste accumulating directly beneath the bed. Modern people often imagine a queen's bedroom with canopy beds, soft mattresses, and air filled with incense. In reality, the atmosphere in most royal chambers was a permanent cocktail of stagnant breath, human sweat, and excrement. The reason lay right under their beds. In many European courts, the chamber pot was an inseparable utensil. These pots were crafted with immense intricacy, some made of glazed ceramic, others cast from solid silver with ornate engravings. However, what lay inside was a different story. Aristocrats relieved themselves directly into the pot, then pushed it deep under the bed or tucked it into a corner. The core issue was that they were rarely emptied immediately. In the winter of 1685, at a grand estate in the French countryside, a countess awoke at 5 in the morning. The air in the room, sealed tight overnight, was thick. The dying hearth radiated heat, inadvertently warming the brimming porcelain pot hidden beneath the bed. As she stepped onto the carpet, her heel accidentally pressed into a yellow streak leaking from the rim. She didn't flinch. No expression of disgust appeared. She calmly pulled out a handkerchief, wiped her heel, tossed the cloth aside, and proceeded to call for her breakfast tray. They ate bread and drank tea in a room saturated with that stench. This endurance lasted so long that the elite's sense of smell seemed to undergo local paralysis. They learned to breathe that air as a natural rhythm of royal life. Palaces housed thousands, from princes to servants. Yet the sewage system was practically non-existent. When a noble relieved themselves at night, it was difficult for a servant to carry the pot through miles of dark corridors to find a waste pit. Consequently, the waste simply stayed in the bedroom. Records indicate that during busy festivals, when the staff could not keep up with the workload, this waste could accumulate for days. And it only got worse once they left the bedroom. During long banquets with endless food and drink, physiological needs would strike. Guests wore gowns weighing over 10 kilograms or tight breeches. They simply didn't want to walk the long distance back to their rooms. Historical witnesses at the Palace of Versailles left numerous records complaining about courtiers slipping behind thick velvet curtains, corners of hallways, or staircases to relieve themselves. Those walking behind would unknowingly step into the traces of those before them, dragging the liquid across the polished wooden floors. Number 2. Stale urine. The royal laundry detergent. If you look at the crisp white linen collars of a 16th century duke, the first impression is one of impeccable neatness. In our age, that white signifies soap and fresh sunlight. But in many European castles, to maintain the brightness of fabrics in direct contact with skin, the servants largely bypassed soap. They needed a more aggressive, potent, and daily available solution: human urine. Soap during this period was a luxury item, boiled manually from animal fat and ash, and was not always available in the massive quantities needed for a palace. As a substitute, housekeepers used chamber lye, stale urine left to decompose for days. When urine is left to rot, it automatically releases a powerful amount of natural ammonia. Ammonia was the key to effective bleaching, capable of breaking down layers of sweat, grime, and oils trapped in the fabric fibers. Imagine the outdoor laundry area behind a grand estate. Dozens of large oak vats stand in rows, filled with a murky amber liquid topped with a film of foam. When the wind blows, the pungent, acrid scent stings the eyes of any stranger. Weekly, servants would collect urine from the very chamber pots under their masters' beds and pour it into these vats, patiently waiting for the mixture to ripen. The queen's linen chemises, hair ribbons, and bedsheets were not carefully hand-washed. They were plunged straight into the depths of these thick urine vats. After soaking for hours, the servants would take the sodden laundry to the riverbank, beating the fabric with wooden clubs against worn stones to rinse away the residue before wringing and drying them. The result? Clothes were returned labeled clean. To the naked eye, the stains were gone, but olfactorily, the linen remained saturated with a permanent scent of ammonia. The nobility wore these fabrics against their skin every day, their senses so conditioned that they perceived the pungent sting of urine as the very proof of cleanliness. But using urine was not the final limit. The concept of undergarments was very loose, especially for royal women. When their natural cycle arrived, queens and princesses had no pads or tampons. What they were forced to use was material salvaged from bogs or reused from wartime camps filled with wounded soldiers. Number 3. Moss and rags. The primitive sanitary pads. For a modern woman, that time of the month is a minor inconvenience easily managed. But place yourself in the shoes of a 15th century European princess. There were no pads, no tampons, and even the concept of undergarments to hold everything in place was largely foreign. How did they manage beneath those heavy ball gowns? Every month, trusted handmaidens would quietly bring in a basket containing items resembling wartime medical supplies. Shredded old linen and dried moss, specifically sphagnum moss, known colloquially as blood moss. Why moss? Because this plant, harvested from bogs, has extraordinary absorbent properties. Ironically, this was the same moss healers frantically stuffed into the open wounds of soldiers on the battlefield. From the muddy marshes to the blood-stained camps, this crude material became the only hygiene solution for the most powerful women on the continent. Imagine a 4-hour royal court session. The queen sits upright on her carved throne, smiling at ambassadors. But beneath the billowing layers of her skirt, she is struggling to hold a roll of moss-stuffed cloth in place, using only her thigh muscles. Without specialized underwear, these crude pads could shift or fall out at any moment. The sensation of dampness, irritation, and the constant dread of an accident in the middle of the palace was a form of psychological pressure no chronicle ever recorded. Furthermore, no sterilization process existed. A moss pulled from nature and half-washed rags were applied directly to the most sensitive areas. Consequently, chronic gynecological infections became uninvited guests in royal life. They suffered in silence, viewing the burning rashes as an inevitable fate of the female body. If managing their cycle was a silent, desperate battle, another hygiene activity displayed social division in the most brutal and public way. Those were the rare days they decided to wash with water. Number 4. Communal bathing. A strict hierarchy of rank. When thinking of bathing in ancient castles, you might imagine rose-petal-strewn tubs and steam rising between stone walls. There was steam, but the contents of the tub told a different story. In many European estates, a bathing day was not a relaxation session. It was a ritual of social ranking. The rules were simple: one room, one tub, and no changing the water. You must understand the infrastructure of the time. There were no hot and cold faucets. To have a warm bath, servants had to haul dozens of buckets of cold water from deep wells, boil them in the kitchen, and carry them up cramped spiral staircases. Filling a large wooden tub consumed nearly half a day of grueling labor. No one had the energy or the firewood to change the water for every individual. Thus, the order of entry was an absolute rule. The highest-ranking individual, the lord, lady, or a prestigious guest, went first. The water was clear, warm, and pleasant. After they emerged, the tub remained. Next were the high-ranking housekeepers, then the personal servants. One by one, they stripped and entered. Imagine being the wood-gathering maid, and the lowest in the hierarchy, standing last in line. By the time it was your turn, the tub was no longer filled with water. It was cold, murky, and gray. The surface floated with a sickening film, a cocktail of curdled soap, sweat, dead skin, and grime left behind by 5 or 6 bodies. Yet, you still had to enter. You soaked in that thick, recycled fluid and believed you were cleansing yourself. In reality, the last people to bathe were merely rinsing their skin in a massive colony of bacteria and filth. They emerged from the tub dirtier than before they undressed. Bathing was not about cleaning, it was a chain of smearing bacteria. Yet, even this communal bath was a rare luxury. Because for the elite, touching hot water was a dangerous game that could cost them their lives. Number 5. The fear of hot water. Pores as gateways for death. This fear of bathing was not a sudden burst of laziness, but a medical belief deeply rooted after the Black Death. European physicians issued a warning that terrified the elite. Hot water is the gateway for the Grim Reaper. They argued that heat would swing open the skin's pores, creating tunnels that sucked toxic air and miasma directly into the internal organs. Thus, stripping naked to soak in warm water was suddenly viewed as inviting death. To defend themselves, the elite chose a solution that sounds grotesque today. They let their bodies stay filthy. Many believed that the layers of sweat, natural sebum, and dust accumulating on the skin would form a biological armor that sealed every pore. Try to imagine the skin of someone who hasn't touched water for months. The excess oils mixed with dead cells eventually caked into gray patches around the neck, armpits, and skin folds. The skin felt permanently tacky. The odor was the sour stench of stagnant, fermented sweat. Historical records reveal that King Louis XIV of France bathed only a handful of times in his decades of reign. A Russian ambassador was so revolted, he noted in his diary that the king stank like a wild beast. But the king and his courtiers were unbothered. Clad in that thick layer of grime, they felt absolutely safe from the diseases raging outside the palace walls. Without water to wash away that stench and grime, how did they clean themselves? And the answer lies in a makeshift hygiene method, where they forced a piece of fabric to do the work of a river. Number 6. Linen undergarments, the total substitute for bathing. To solve the problem of cleaning without water, many courts adopted a concept called the dry bath. This responsibility was delegated entirely to the linen undergarments worn against the skin. Contemporary medicine claimed that the friction of linen against the body acted like a sponge, sucking grime, oils, and sweat out of the pores. The procedure was simple. The servant stripped off the old linen shirt, dressed the master in a new one, and the bathing ritual was complete. However, the most disgusting detail was that they rarely changed these shirts daily. A thin white linen shirt was forced to embrace a body that never bathed. Day after day, it absorbed sour sweat and peeling grime. The wearer would eat, sleep, and dance in that state. The undergarment was usually only ordered off when it had turned deep yellow, smelled suffocating, or the edges began to fray from being eroded by body chemicals. Imagine the scene inside the dressing room. When a servant pulled the undershirt off a count's back, one could almost hear the dry, raspy sound of fabric that had become stiffened by weeks of accumulated sweat. The cloth was so rigid that if thrown onto the floor, it could almost maintain its folds and stand upright. Beneath that layer, the body was essentially being fermented in its own cutaneous waste. Yet, as they slipped into a fresh linen shirt, the wearer smiled with satisfaction, convinced they had been purified according to the highest standards, and the grime on the skin and the smelly linen were inanimate. But upon the heads of the queens, something vivid and crawling was constantly breeding. Number 7. Wigs, the mobile home of lice and fleas. If there was anything that best represented the false glamour of this era, it was the towering, billowing wigs of the 17th and 18th centuries. In many courts, the height of the wig was proportional to power. The taller, heavier, and more intricately curled, the higher the wearer's status. But a close look at the hairline would shatter the illusion. These structures were made from real human hair. To define the height and hold the shape, hairdressers smeared them with a mixture of animal fat, usually lard or mutton tallow, mixed with flour. No one took such a complex structure to be washed with water, as it would immediately lose its form. Thus, the mixture of fat, flour, and the wearer's scaly scalp was sealed tight. It inadvertently turned the wig into a damp, nutrient-rich incubator, ideal for lice and fleas to nest. A lady might proudly wear a meter-high wig adorned with ribbons and feathers, but beneath that white powder were thousands of crawling lice. They bit, sucked blood, and laid eggs amidst the fat-clogged strands. The itching was so intense that jewelers crafted long, thin ivory rods for ladies to slide into the wig and scratch their scalps mid-banquet. They even produced lice traps, infused with animal blood to lure the parasites in. Many wigs were so complex that their owners had to sleep sitting up for weeks to avoid ruining the shape, living with a flea nest on their heads month after month. The supreme symbol of authority was actually a living ecosystem feeding on their flesh every day. Waste under the bed, sweat-caked linen, and lice on the head. You must wonder, how did they survive an enclosed room with hundreds of such nobles without suffocating? Number 8. Pungent perfumes. The veil for weeks of stench. Imagine yourself in the middle of a crowded ballroom in the 17th century. Candlelight reflects off billowing dresses, and music drifts through the air. But if you were truly there, your sense of smell would be assaulted by a horrific reality. How could hundreds of people carrying sweat-caked linen, lice-infested wigs, and skin that hadn't touched water in months stand next to each other without vomiting? And the solution of the courts was not to remove the cause, but to create another scent aggressive enough to crush everything else. This was the era of heavy perfumes and pomanders. Perfumes of this period were rarely subtle. They were formulated in extreme concentrations, heavy with musk, ambergris, and pungent oils. More careful nobles wore pomanders, exquisitely carved, hollow metal spheres stuffed with herbs and aromatic resins. When standing too close to someone with an overwhelming odor, or passing a corridor saturated with waste from scattered pots, They would bring this sphere to their nose to save their lungs. It functioned as a mobile gas mask. However, perfume cannot make a foul smell vanish. It only mingles with it. The air became a sticky or indescribable concoction, the aggressive sweetness of musk clashing violently with the sharp sting of ammonia, rancid animal fat, and fermented body odor. Foreign ambassadors, from cultures used to regular bathing, described entering a European palace as entering an acidic pickling shed that had been accidentally sprayed with perfume. Visitors often had to hold their breath to hide their impending nausea. They used pungent scents to deceive one another. But there was another deception aimed at the eyes, far more cruel. A beauty ritual where they slathered poison onto their faces daily, just for status. Number 9. Venetian ceruse, the beauty eating the master's face. Disgust did not stop at stench or parasites. It was present on the surface of beauty itself. In many European courts, especially during the 16th century, what a deathly pale skin was the benchmark of nobility. To achieve this, they used Venetian ceruse, a paste blended from vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead, a heavy metal with extreme toxicity. Every morning, a servant would slather this thick powder onto the master's face. It covered all pockmarks and freckles, creating a smooth, stark white mask. But the moment it sat on the skin, the lead began to seep through the pores, entering the bloodstream and conducting slow biological destruction from within. Long-term use caused chronic poisoning. The real skin beneath began to protest. It shriveled, peeled in gray patches, and ulcerated. Hairlines were eroded by the chemicals, and lead entered the gums, causing teeth to rot and turn black. Breath smelled of necrotic metal. The most bitter part was the vicious cycle. And as their natural skin became hideous, these women panicked, applying even thicker layers to hide the rot. Capping off their health, they faced agonizing cramps and paralyzed muscles. Behind those splendid oil portraits lay faces being eaten alive by their own beauty formula. The candlelight in the royal halls would eventually fade. When the billowing dresses were removed, the lice-infested wigs put away, and the chamber pot pulled from under the bed, what remained was not the glamour of power. It was devastation. The devastation of skin peeling from lead poisoning, of bodies itching with disease, and of a sense of smell paralyzed by filth. When a society dictates standards contrary to nature, humans are willing to endure physical erosion just to be recognized as those standing above others. That royal shell was built from the most decayed materials. Glamorous films will never let you smell the true scent of history. But now that the darkness is unveiled, which detail haunts you the most? Leave a comment below. See you next time.